All right, so my second talk is about studies we have done at ITU in Denmark. And this one is assessment of cybersecurity in Denmark, or a study about how Danish companies perceive, how Danish tech companies implement cybersecurity and privacy measures in their workflows, in their software development lifecycle, and so on. And the motivation behind this project was that, again, Denmark, it is a highly digitalized country. I think, at least among European ones, it is very much on the top of the list in terms of digitalization. Indeed, people use digital services really on a daily basis, very extensive. From my own experience coming from Germany, to me, it felt like quite a stark difference to Germany in terms of digitalization. And the result of it, that Denmark is highly relied on tech and IT infrastructure. So if you have all these services, of course, the assumption is they have to be secure. And cybersecurity R&D is at high alert. So this example is from the report of the Danish Center for Cybersecurity, which states, and I think this has been consistent for the last few years, the threat for cybercrime is very high. The threat from cyber espionage is very high. So it is known that security concerns are indeed need to be taken seriously. The question, however, are they actually being taken seriously? And can solution providers, tech companies, keep up with cybersecurity landscape? And here there are several questions that can be raised, especially considering that the cybersecurity landscape indeed changes. It can change quite rapidly, especially in the recent years. So there are general security developments. There are always new vulnerabilities being discovered, new technology being developed, new attacks, new risks, and so on. But there are also some other changes that one needs to account for, such as changes in legislation, GDPR being one of the large ones in the last years. And then, of course, there are force majeure events, such as the pandemic was relevant when we done this study. If we had to do the study before, then we would ask about the Russian invasion. So there are always changes. There are always some new issues people have to deal with, companies have to deal with. So our question was, is it actually happening? Can companies implement proper security measures, also keeping the need for changes in mind? And what are the challenges that they face? With these regards, we again conducted a mixed method approach, so our study, our investigation had two stages. One of them was an online survey, where we surveyed 107 participants from diverse companies with diverse roles. So the survey was set to participants with management roles, to software developers, to security experts. So basically, the idea was to cover all different kinds of roles in companies. And the goal of the survey was to get a broad overview of security and privacy practices and challenges in the companies, and get some maybe quantitative insights and trends and so on. And following this quantitative investigation, we conducted ethnographic interviews. We had 11 participants, again, from different roles in companies, management, software developers, and security experts. And the goal was to get a deep understanding of the selected issues. So based on the survey, we would look at what kind of findings we found the most interesting, the most important, and then do a deep dive, so to say, in these ethnographic interviews. And we investigate several topics. We looked at general security and privacy management and policies. We looked at how these security and privacy measures are integrated specifically in software development processes. And then, since I mentioned these two quite large events, by the time we did the project, we looked into experiences and issues with the GDPR implementation, and also experiences and issues with the pandemic-related changes. Most importantly, the need to work remotely, but also any kind of other measures that needed to be done because of the pandemic. So I will present the results. Again, these are just a selection of the results. We had much more, and also in the paper there are much more. So when it came to general security and privacy management and policies, so we found in the quantitative part that the majority of the participants, for example, said that they participated in security trainings, at least to some extent. But yet what we found concerning is that a large amount of participants either did not participate in the trainings, so they were not aware of the trainings, or they were aware but chose not to participate. And on top of that, what we also found concerning is that even among the participants who did participate in the trainings, quite a large number of them, especially in large companies, said that they did not find these trainings useful. So concluding from this, less than half participants actually take part in trainings that they also find useful. So this is not great. And what we also find from the qualitative findings is that security in general had low prioritization, in a sense that our participants spoke about there being other stuff that is more urgent, that is more pressing, such as implementing new features, or as they spoke about it, implementing features that the customers are actually willing to pay for. So security was not perceived as part of daily tasks, and there was not extensive focus on security trainings because, once again, there was not so much perceived need for security when it came to daily decision making. And another important trait in this is that security was often expressed as being someone else's responsibility. So our participants spoke about, when we asked them about how they take care about their security, they spoke that they have some external vendors and they take care of the security. And when we ask follow-up questions, for example, so do you have any ways to vet these vendors or to audit them? They just say, no, we trust them. And also the management spoke about reliance on developers, again, saying that we have guys who know what they're doing, so they do something security related. Which when we then spoke to developers says, yes, everyone expects us to do something security related, to take care about security, but we're not really given time or space or opportunities to actually take this issue seriously. When it came to integration of security and privacy in software development processes, again, we saw that in our survey, large amount of participants claim that they are fine, and they are indeed integrating security and privacy into development lifecycle, either early from the initial phases or during the development cycle continuously. Still, a large share of participants said that they either don't integrate security into software development lifecycle at all, which is of course very concerning, or they only do this after the fact, which is better than not at all, but still it is considered as a bad practice, because if you only take care about security after your product is finished or almost finished, it requires much more time and resources to fix any security measures you find. So this is usually not recommended in the practice. And again, when we talked about these issues in the interviews, once again, we found this issue of unclear responsibilities, that different people in different roles perceive that someone else is responsible. Managements believe that developers should be responsible for this. Developers felt like they're not really given tasks to do this, so they don't do this. And there was some expressions of lack of knowledge, in a sense that people spoke about lack of trainings, lack of any kind of competence raising measures about how to actually implement security. Again, since we're talking about the need to account for the changes in the cybersecurity landscape, this lack of trainings is even more critical, because you cannot just assume that it is enough for someone to take some security courses in the university studies that had been done with this, but still there were no trainings opportunities offered, or if sometimes managers spoke about trainings, they just spoke of it as something like, if developers want to participate in some conference, they should come to us and ask. But then again, the developers were not quite aware that this would be an option. And as mentioned before, lack of prioritization was something that is quite relevant, with functional requirements being considered to be more important than security. And whenever people spoke about security, they often spoke of it as mainly for the compliance reasons. So basically, the idea is, now we have to check these checkboxes and then we're done. So security was not perceived as something you actually need to protect your product and your clients, your customers, your partners against cyber attacks. It was something that you need to do to be compliant and to avoid being fined. We talk about GDPR implementation. Again, in the quantitative studies, we saw that the majority of companies implemented at least some changes after the GDPR came into force. And here you can see that most changes were about how data subjects were informed about data collection. Again, recalling my previous talk, maybe it was not always the optimal way to do this, but at least it was done in some way. And but there were changes in all of these kind of aspects that were relevant to the GDPR. And again, when we talked about this issue in the interviews, on one side, some people talked about that indeed the GDPR forced them to improve awareness about data collection, so they were actually forced to actually sit down, take a look at their product, understand what data is collected, how this data is stored. Do they actually need all this data? So in this sense, this was a very positive effect of the GDPR, in a sense that they actually had to think about the data they collect and what to do with this data. At the same point, there was no clear awareness about the scope of the GDPR, such as what is considered personal data, which falls under the scope of the GDPR and what isn't. And people commented on lack of guidance. So they spoke about the difficulties to implement the GDPR, such as the need to really change their policies regarding data deletion to make sure that the data is not stored on any backups, and so on. So they spoke of this as being some challenge they had to really take time and resources to implement. And people spoke about communication challenges in a sense that so some participants spoke that there were indeed established processes of communication in their companies, but some mentioned that if someone has questions, like for example, developers have questions, how to implement, or are they allowed to collect this or other kinds of data in their program, they would not know where to go and whom to ask. So obviously it was a problem. And finally, we spoke about the pandemic-related changes, at least in our study. And this part was done, I believe it was done in summer 2020. So it was, I think, after the first wave of pandemic. So at this point, at least in Denmark, it was kind of people started getting more relaxed. Not quite so much relaxed, but at least somewhat relaxed. And the results have shown that for the majority of the participants, the pandemic did not change their security concerns. So the majority were either not concerned as before as during the pandemic, or the participants that were concerned before the pandemic, they said that it hasn't changed during the pandemic, and only a relatively small amount of participants said that they actually have increased concern because of the pandemic. And again, in the interviews, people spoke about not having any changes in their companies when it came to pandemic-related policies. They spoke about inherent trust that is present, in a sense that people can just take their laptops home. They will not do anything funny with it, even if there is sensitive data stored on them. It is all fine. People will trust each other. People spoke about use of cloud-based services, saying that basically, we already had everything in the cloud, so it doesn't change whether we sit in the office or whether we sit at home. Some people spoke about having even less security concerns during the pandemic, and this was connected to this idea that working from home was perceived as a safe environment. So these people were saying that, okay, if I have everything in my office, then there are other people who have access to my office. There is cleaning staff. There may be some external guests coming in and out. Wherever I'm from home, I know that I'm the only one, or me and my family members are the only ones having access to my computer and my data, so it is safer. And yet there were people who acknowledged these small security concerns. They spoke of new policies being implemented when it came to remote work and so on. And some participants talk about security as a catalyst, saying that there were some changes with regard to security policies. We have been planning to implement them for a long time, but we always postpone them. But now, since the pandemic, we basically had no choice but to do it now. So to summarize, I'm not sure how well I am within the time, but this is the last slide. So security remains a critical issue. I mentioned that it is not that it's a big issue in Denmark, as of course it is everywhere around the world. And again, it is known, it has been widely publicized in the media and in the reports of the governmental agencies. It is known that data breaches exist, they are costly. So this is the first headline here is an example of the ransomware attack on Maersk, which is one of the largest Danish companies that was quite costly. And the data breach can damage customer trust. They can possibly be a danger to international security, as again, in the last few months, there have been warnings about increased security concerns because of Russia-Ukraine war. However, what we have noticed that despite all this media attention and despite indeed people paying at least lip service to security measures are often being neglected because they're perceived in conflict with business requirements, they're under-prioritized, and so on. So the question is, can we do better? And by do better, we have to think about following aspects. Just from the study, we have to think about ongoing education of developers, because once again, everything changes, technology changes, threat landscape changes. So we have to ensure that developers are really being educated, not just once at the beginning of their career, but all the time during their professional life. We have to really consider the involvement of the management, because it was a strong theme in our study, in a sense that the management felt that developers should take care of everything, but not really giving them the proper resources for this. And this all ties into the general security culture of the company, which again, how do you create a culture where everyone feels like, yes, security is important, and all of us has to play a part in ensuring the security of it. So with this, I conclude my talk. As I said, this is only a small part of the findings of the project, so there is a full report that you can read, and I will be happy to answer your questions during the panel.